The Battle of Bannockburn. By 1314, Robert the Bruce had steadily regained control over most of Scotland, retaking key castles once held by Edward II. His forces also launched frequent raids into northern England, striking as far as Carlisle. In response to these provocations, Edward, with the support of Thomas, Earl of Lancaster and other nobles, began assembling a massive military campaign aimed at reclaiming lost ground. The English army, estimated to be between 15,000 and 20,000 strong, comprised a mix of heavily armored knights, foot soldiers, and archers. Meanwhile, Robert the Bruce had set his sights on Stirling Castle, a strategically vital stronghold in Scotland. The castle's English commander, Philip de Mowbray, had declared that if Edward did not relieve the siege by the 24th of June, he would surrender to the Scots. Learning of this, Edward hastened his march north from Berwick-upon-Tweed, determined to break the Scottish encirclement and secure a decisive victory. However, Robert, leading a smaller but well-prepared army of 5,500 to 6,500 men, primarily spearmen, had no intention of allowing Edward to reach Stirling unopposed. Opening skirmishes and the eve of battle. The first engagement occurred on the 23rd of June, as the English army attempted to force its way across the Bannockburn, a small river surrounded by treacherous marshland. Scottish forces, concealed in advantageous positions, launched a series of skirmishes to harass the advancing English. During this phase, the young English knight Sir Henry de Bohun spotted Robert the Bruce in the open. Seeking glory, Bohun charged the Scottish king in single combat. In a legendary moment, Robert dodged Bohun's attack and killed him with a single blow of his axe, shattering his opponent's skull. This display of bravery and skill greatly emboldened the Scottish troops. Despite this setback, Edward pressed forward, confident that his numerical superiority and well-trained cavalry would grant him an easy victory. He had, however, underestimated both the terrain and the discipline of the Scottish forces. The battle unfolds. On the morning of the 24th of June, the bulk of the English army encountered the main Scottish force, which had emerged from the New Park woodland near Bannockburn. Edward, not expecting the Scots to engage in open battle at this location, had kept his forces in marching formation rather than battle formation, placing his archers, one of his most formidable assets, at the rear rather than at the front where they could disrupt Scottish spear formations. This tactical oversight would prove costly. As the English cavalry advanced, they found themselves constricted by the narrow and uneven terrain, limiting their ability to maneuver effectively. Robert's disciplined schiltrons, or spear formations, held firm against repeated cavalry charges. With each successive assault, the English knights became trapped in the swampy ground, making them easy targets for the Scottish spearmen. The lack of space and ineffective coordination turned what should have been a display of English military might into a chaotic slaughter. Edward's archers, belatedly brought forward to provide support, initially caused heavy Scottish casualties. However, Robert countered by sending his light cavalry to outflank and disperse the English longbowmen, depriving Edward's forces of their best means of breaking the schiltrons. With the English army now in complete disarray, panic set in among the ranks. Edward's escape and the aftermath. As the battle reached its climax, the English commanders struggled to restore order. Edward himself remained on the battlefield, unwilling to accept the possibility of defeat. However, as the situation deteriorated, the Earl of Pembroke forcibly pulled the king away, realizing that further resistance would only result in his capture or death. With Scottish forces hot on their heels, Edward and his retinue fled southward, barely escaping the battlefield. In his retreat, Edward vowed to establish a Carmelite religious house in Oxford if he survived, a promise he later fulfilled. He eventually reached Dunbar, from where he took a ship back to Berwick before continuing to York. Meanwhile, Stirling Castle, deprived of reinforcement, fell to the Scots shortly after. Historian Roy Haynes described the Battle of Bannockburn as a calamity of stunning proportions for England. The battle resulted in heavy English casualties, including numerous knights and noblemen, while the Scottish forces suffered relatively light losses. The catastrophic defeat severely weakened Edward's authority in the north and marked a turning point in the First War of Scottish Independence. Consequences and the strengthening of Scottish independence. The repercussions of Bannockburn were profound. In the years following the battle, Robert the Bruce took advantage of his victory, consolidating Scottish control over nearly all English-held fortresses in Scotland. The Scottish army also intensified its raids into northern England, further destabilizing Edward's rule. The defeat dealt a massive blow to English morale and Edward's prestige, emboldening his enemies both within England and abroad. Edward's defeat at Bannockburn exacerbated tensions with his own barons, particularly Lancaster and his faction, who viewed the king's military failure as yet another example of his ineptitude. Political instability within England increased, contributing to the eventual rebellion that would culminate in the Despencer War, 1321 to 1322, and ultimately, Edward's overthrow in 1326. On the international stage, the victory at Bannockburn helped legitimize Robert the Bruce's claim to the Scottish throne. Though England continued to resist full recognition of Scottish independence, the battle set the stage for the eventual Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328, in which England formally acknowledged Scotland as an independent kingdom. Bannockburn was more than just a battle, it was a defining moment in medieval British history. It proved that a well-led, determined force could triumph over a numerically superior army, reshaping the balance of power in the British Isles for years to come. For Edward, it was one of the greatest military failures of his reign, while for Robert the Bruce, it was his crowning achievement, solidifying his place as Scotland's most celebrated warrior king. Famine and criticism. Following the catastrophic defeat at Bannockburn, England entered a period of severe political instability, economic decline, and widespread suffering. The Earls of Lancaster and Warwick took full advantage of Edward's weakened position, exerting their influence to force the re-implementation of the Ordinances of 1311, a set of reforms intended to curtail royal power. This renewed push for constitutional limits on Edward's authority placed the king in a politically vulnerable position, further reducing his ability to govern effectively. By 1316, Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, had assumed the role of head of the Royal Council, promising a new reform commission to enforce the ordinances. However, his tenure quickly proved ineffective. Disagreements with other barons and, possibly, personal ill health led Lancaster to abandon his responsibilities, plunging the government into further dysfunction. Over the next 2 years, Lancaster refused to attend Parliament or engage with Edward directly, leading to a near-total breakdown in royal governance. With the kingdom paralysed and the baronial factions locked in a power struggle, any hopes of renewing military campaigns in Scotland were dashed, and fears of civil war loomed large. It was only after extensive negotiations, once again mediated by the Earl of Pembroke, that Edward and Lancaster reached a fragile agreement known as the Treaty of Leek, August 1318. The treaty granted pardons to Lancaster and his followers and restructured the Royal Council, temporarily diffusing hostilities. However, despite the outward appearance of reconciliation, tensions remained, and the kingdom's deeper issues, famine, economic failure, and foreign threats, continued to mount. The Great Famine and economic collapse. Edward's struggles were compounded by the onset of the Great Famine, 1314 to 1321, a devastating period of food shortages that affected all of northern Europe. The crisis began with torrential rains in late 1314, followed by a harsh winter and continued unseasonably wet weather through 1321. This prolonged climate catastrophe decimated agricultural yields, leading to successive crop failures and the widespread death of livestock. With bad harvests year after year, food prices soared. England's economy, already strained by military expenditures, suffered further as wool exports plummeted, depriving the crown of much-needed revenue. Despite Edward's attempts to control food prices, regulate trade, and import grain, his policies had little effect in alleviating the crisis. Hoarding became rampant, black markets thrived, and large portions of the population succumbed to starvation and disease. The king's requisitioning of food supplies for his court and military garrisons further exacerbated resentment among the peasantry. Famine led to severe social unrest, as communities, faced with starvation, turned on local lords, the clergy, and merchants suspected of hoarding grain. Villages in southern and eastern England saw outbreaks of violence against landlords accused of unfair taxation and withholding resources. Widespread banditry increased, as starving peasants resorted to theft and lawlessness in desperate attempts to survive. Reports of cannibalism and people consuming animals typically deemed inedible, such as horses and dogs, further highlighted the depth of suffering. In addition to domestic hardship, Robert the Bruce took full advantage of England's weakened state. The Scottish army intensified its raids, launching devastating attacks on Carlisle, Berwick, Lancashire, and Yorkshire, even threatening York itself. In response, Edward mobilized an expensive but ultimately failed military campaign in 1319 to curb the Scottish incursions. However, the famine made it increasingly difficult to supply his forces, leading to yet another military humiliation for the king. Adding to England's woes, Robert's brother, Edward Bruce, led a Scottish invasion of Ireland in 1315, where he declared himself High King of Ireland. The campaign lasted for 3 years, further draining England's military resources. It was only in 1318 that Edward Bruce was finally defeated at the battle fought by Edward II's justiciar in Ireland, Edmund Butler. Bruce's severed head was sent back to Edward II, serving as a rare moment of victory amidst the ongoing turmoil. Domestically, discontent boiled over into open rebellion. Revolts broke out in Lancashire, Bristol, and Glamorgan, 1315 to 1316, forcing Edward's government to divert resources to suppress the unrest. Though these uprisings were swiftly crushed, they reflected the widespread anger and desperation gripping the kingdom. Blame, criticism, and religious backlash. Amidst famine and political crisis, many in England began interpreting the country's hardships as divine punishment for Edward's failures. Clerics and chroniclers described this period as the evil times of Edward II, a condemnation of the king's inability to lead his people effectively. Criticism of Edward was often personal. His perceived lack of martial prowess, his unconventional interests, and his reliance on favourites drew scorn from many quarters. Chronicles mocked his interest in rural hobbies such as ditch digging and thatching, activities considered unworthy of a king. A particularly bizarre episode occurred in 1318, when a mentally ill man named John of Powderham appeared in Oxford, claiming that he was the true Edward II, while the sitting king was a changeling swapped at birth. Although John was swiftly executed, his claims resonated with a public eager to find explanations for the king's perceived inadequacies. The incident only reinforced the belief that Edward lacked the legitimacy and capability to rule. The rise of royal favourites and growing hostility. Despite widespread opposition, Edward continued to favour certain courtiers, bestowing upon them vast lands and titles, further alienating the nobility. Notably, Edward divided the extensive de Clare inheritance between two of his close allies, Hugh Audley and Roger de Moray, instantly making them among the richest men in England. This enraged many other barons, particularly those who had expected a share of the inheritance. The favoritism extended beyond land grants. Edward's inner circle remained unchanged, despite previous attempts by the Ordainers to remove them. His refusal to part with his closest allies deepened the hostility among nobles who had once been willing to compromise. Even moderate barons who had brokered the Treaty of Leek in 1318 began losing faith in Edward's leadership, sensing that his pattern of misgovernance would continue. Violence seemed inevitable as opposition hardened against the king. Towards rebellion and civil war. The combination of political stagnation, economic devastation, failed military campaigns, and blatant favoritism created a climate ripe for rebellion. By the early 1320s, Edward's grip on power was slipping rapidly. Many of his former allies had abandoned him, and his increasingly erratic decision-making only fueled further resentment. The seeds of civil war had already been sown. It was no longer a question of if Edward's rule would be challenged, but when. The next phase of Edward's reign would be defined by internal strife, betrayals, and, ultimately, his dramatic downfall at the hands of his own barons. Thanks for listening. Like, comment, and subscribe to Medieval Chronicles 1066 for more journeys back to the Middle Ages. Stay curious.